The town of Havenwood hadn't changed. Not really. 12 years. A bachelor's degree. A few dead-end jobs. And the usual quarter-life crisis had sent me spiraling back to the one place I thought I understood. But the truth was, every familiar street corner, every clapboard house with its porch swing, was less a comfort and more a hollow echo. The air here was heavy with a peacefulness that felt less like tranquility and more like suffocation. I was 25, yet walking past the old elementary school, I felt the phantom weight of a backpack on my shoulders. I saw the ghost of a skinny kid, me, tossing a baseball with Michael. Michael. His memory was the quiet poison in Havenwood's sweet air. He'd been gone since we were 13. Poof, vanished from the face of the earth, right off the school field one autumn evening. The police searched, the town grieved, and I just left. I carried the guilt of having been the last one to see him, the last one to argue with him over a stupid trading card, and then the one who moved on. My life became a deliberate, messy sprint away from the silent questions that hung over this town. My apartment was a small, dusty rental near the old water tower. One night I couldn't sleep. The silence was too loud. I pulled on a hoodie and decided to walk off the restless feeling, gravitating, as I always did, toward the familiar paths of my childhood. I found myself by the closed-up baseball diamond, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of a single sodium lamp. That's when I saw him. He was standing by the chain-link backstop, watching me. For a moment, my mind tried to construct a logical explanation. A local kid, maybe. But the posture, the way he held his hands, it was instantly, sickeningly familiar. He wore the same faded blue t-shirt and slightly ripped jeans he'd worn every summer when we were 13. But here was the impossible part. He looked 13. He was the same height, the same slender build, with the same unruly mop of dark hair. Not a day had aged on him. My heart didn't just pound. It seemed to skip a beat, then resume with a frenetic, irregular rhythm. I froze. I told myself it was the light, the late hour, the exhaustion. A mental trick. This wasn't Michael. It couldn't be. I took one hesitant step backward. The figure didn't move, didn't wave, didn't acknowledge me with any adult awareness. He simply tilted his head, the way children do when they are genuinely confused, and then a small, slow smile stretched across his face. It wasn't the joyful grin of a happy kid. It was cold, wide, and vacant. I turned and ran. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until my hand was shaking over the deadbolt on my apartment door. I spent the next 2 days in a blur of forced rationality, convinced I'd hallucinated the whole thing. Then came the night of the phone call. I was lying in bed, the TV humming low, when my old, rarely used landline rang. It wasn't a number I recognized. I answered, my voice thick with sleep. "Hello?" There was no sound on the other end, just the hiss of static. I was about to hang up when a voice, thin and clear, whispered into the receiver. It was a voice I hadn't heard in 12 years, yet every inflection was seared into my brain. The voice of a 13-year-old boy. It didn't say my name or a greeting. It just asked a question, one we used to ask each other when we were hunting for something we'd buried in the dirt behind his yard. "Are we still looking for it?" The blood drained from my face. I dropped the phone, and the line went dead instantly. I was no longer dealing with a memory or a delusion. Michael was back, and he hadn't grown up. Something truly impossibly dark had come home. And the worst part was, it remembered me. As I stared at the dark window, a sudden, chilling flicker plunged my apartment into absolute darkness, leaving me alone with the sound of my own ragged breath. The night the lights went out marked the end of my denial. I knew with a certainty that iced my veins that the figure I'd seen and the voice on the phone were one and the same. Michael. But he wasn't my friend anymore. He was a relic, a terrifying, unaging shadow of the past come back to claim me. My days became a blur of frantic paranoia. I stopped opening the blinds. I slept with a lamp on and the TV tuned to static, anything to drown out the oppressive silence of Havenwood. I tried talking to a coworker, muttering something about sleep deprivation and vivid memories, but the moment the words, "my friend who died," crossed my lips, the horror felt too absurd to share. I was completely isolated, trapped in a nightmare only I could see. The haunting escalated from whispers to intrusions. It started with the knocking, always at 3:17 a.m. 3 soft, rapid taps on my apartment door, never loud enough to wake the neighbors, just enough to yank me from the edge of sleep and send my heart into a dizzying sprint. I'd grab the nearest object, a baseball bat, a book, and peer through the peephole. Nothing, just the empty, fluorescent-lit hallway. But when I'd check the doorknob, it would always be slightly cold and damp, as if a small, wet hand had just pressed against it. Then came the mirrors. I'd be brushing my teeth, and for a split second my reflection would warp. Not into a monster, but into the wide-eyed, slightly frightened face of a 13-year-old boy. It was Michael, standing right behind my own shoulders, his eyes fixed on mine with a profound, terrifying sadness. I'd whip around, but the room would be empty. The light from the bathroom bulb seemed to dim whenever his image appeared. The worst night, though, was when the words finally came. I was sitting in my living room, scrolling through old town archives on my laptop trying to find anything the police might have missed 12 years ago. The air in the room grew instantly frigid, the kind of cold that feels unnatural indoors. A low, familiar voice, clear as if he were right beside my ear, whispered the line that shattered the last remnants of my sanity. "You left me behind, Alex. You grew up. Now I want you to become like me." The accusation was a physical blow. It wasn't just a threat. It was a profound judgment on my life, on my decision to live and move on. Michael didn't want revenge. He wanted company. He wanted to drag me into his same state of frozen, unaging darkness. Frantic, I grabbed the keys to my car and drove straight to the old elementary school, the place where everything ended. The baseball field was deserted. The moon was a sickly crescent. I walked out to the spot where we used to hang out by the oak tree. The ground was hard and silent, but as I stood there, a different sound started. A soft thudding of tennis shoes against the dirt, running, circling the empty bases. The sound was faint at first, then closer, quicker, always running just beyond the edge of my sight. It was the sound of a boy playing an impossible, eternal game alone. I sunk to my knees, shaking. That's when my fingers brushed against something hard and cold sticking out of the dry dirt. I pulled it out. It was Michael's old key ring. It had a small, chipped plastic charm shaped like a lightning bolt, a cheap piece of junk he'd been obsessed with because he thought it gave him super speed. He'd never been without it. His small, unaged form was standing just at the edge of the tree line, barely visible in the dark. He wasn't running anymore. He was just watching, his head tilted. He knew I had the key ring. "Come play, Alex." The cold voice drifted across the field, sounding exactly as it had that last day. "The game's not over until we both stay here." I clutched the lightning bolt charm, knowing this wasn't just a haunting. This was a direct, inescapable confrontation. The key ring was a piece of him, a terrible clue, and it meant I was now playing his game. A game I had to lose to truly win. I drove until the streetlights of Havenwood faded into the heavy darkness of the town's outer edge. The key ring was burning a cold spot in my palm. I knew where I had to go, not the place Michael disappeared from, but the place he disappeared to. 12 years ago, Michael and I had found an abandoned fallout shelter half hidden beneath a cluster of overgrown pines in the woods behind the old cemetery. It was our secret hideout, our fortress. The lightning bolt charm wasn't just decoration. It was the key, a symbol we'd sworn to use to guide each other back if we ever got lost inside the cramped, dark tunnel. I parked the car on the shoulder and plunged into the woods. The trees were dense, their shadows twisting into impossible shapes. The air was dead still, devoid of the usual nocturnal sounds. When I found the stone slab covering the shelter entrance, It felt less like a hideout and more like a mausoleum. I shoved the stone aside, the scraping sound loud enough to summon the dead. A rush of cold, earthy air, smelling of rot and ancient concrete, hit me. I switched on my phone flashlight and descended the rusted ladder. The tunnel was narrow, leading to a small circular room. Dust motes danced in the single beam of light. And there he was. Michael stood in the center of the room. He was bathed in an unnatural, flickering luminescence that didn't come from my phone. He looked exactly the same, but the smile was gone, replaced by a look of profound, agonizing emptiness. "You came back," he whispered, his voice echoing off the damp concrete walls. "I knew you wouldn't leave the game unfinished." "What happened, Michael?" My voice cracked. "Tell me the truth." He raised a skeletal thin hand. The flickering light intensified, and the shelter walls seemed to dissolve. The cold intensified, and I wasn't just seeing the dark room anymore. I was seeing a flashback, vivid and real, playing out around us. I saw us, 13 years old, arguing fiercely inside this same shelter. We were fighting over some petty insult. Michael had stormed out first, slamming the heavy stone door shut behind him in a fit of rage, trapping me. He thought I'd just unlock it. But then, as he stood outside, something shifted. A terrifying shadow, something vast and indistinct, had descended on the forest, and Michael, paralyzed by fear, had tried to reopen the door. He couldn't. The weight was too much. Then the final, chilling sight. The shadow enveloped him, not violently but slowly, pulling him into the ground. He didn't die. He was claimed, his life, his time, his very essence, locked away by something ancient and malevolent in the earth, leaving behind only the vessel of the boy. He wasn't cursed. He was harvested. The vision ended. The walls were concrete again. "I waited for you to open the door, Alex," Michael said, his eyes now wide and pleading. "But you were too scared to get trapped with me. You finally pushed the rock open and ran. You ran and you grew up." He stepped toward me, his small hands reaching out. "Now I can't move on. I can't leave this place unless someone takes my spot. Join me, Alex. Become like me. We can play forever." He was offering me a horrifying immortality, to be forever 13, forever trapped, a phantom rooted to this ground. I held up the lightning bolt charm. "I left because I was a scared kid, but I came back because I'm an adult. This is not you, Michael. This is what took you." He flinched. For the first time, the perpetual emptiness in his eyes broke, replaced by a momentary flash of the Michael I remembered. Knowing the truth was my only weapon. I saw the weakness. The thing that possessed him was bound by the tragedy of the moment he was claimed. "I won't join you," I whispered, throwing the lightning bolt charm hard against the far concrete wall. "I'm letting you go. It's over." The boy screamed. Not Michael's scream, but a high, unnatural shriek that vibrated through the floor. The lights on my phone and the shelter walls exploded in a flash of blinding white energy. I covered my head, the sound crushing my eardrums. When I looked up, the light was gone. Michael was gone. The room was empty, save for the dust motes and the key charm lying cracked on the floor. I stumbled out of the shelter and back into the forest. The night air was still cold, but the oppressive silence had lifted. I could hear crickets chirping again. The town of Havenwood looked exactly the same as I drove back, peaceful, quiet. But I knew the truth. I had faced the consequence of a childhood fear and survived. I had left Michael in the dark, but in a strange, terrible way. I had finally fulfilled my forgotten promise and set the true Michael free. I made it back to my apartment. I didn't sleep. The morning light filtered through the window, revealing a profound and terrifying stillness. The phone never rang. The mirror showed only my own tired, aged face. Later that afternoon, I packed my bags. I was leaving Havenwood again, this time with a silence that was truly earned. But as I pulled out of the driveway, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For just a second, reflected in the distance near the elementary school, I thought I saw a small, faded blue t-shirt standing by the old oak tree, and I swore I heard a faint, high-pitched laugh carried on the wind, a laugh that was no longer empty but oddly satisfied. The game was over, but perhaps the rules had just changed. The small town in Pennsylvania felt both utterly familiar and completely alien. It wasn't the town itself that was unsettling. It was the suffocating weight of its quiet. The roads were patched with cracked asphalt, the fences around the old yards tilted like tired soldiers, and the silence felt less like peace and more like a heavy blanket pulled over a secret. At 26, I, Ashley, was back not for a visit, but to sell my mother's house, to sever the last tie to this place after her funeral. The house was just as I remembered, full of dust motes dancing in the afternoon sun and the faint, permanent smell of aged wood and lavender. I was working through the attic, a space I hadn't dared to enter since I was a child, trying to decide what to discard and what to save. That's when I found the box labeled simply, Childhood. Inside, beneath a tangle of old friendship bracelets and a faded teddy bear, was a thick stack of photographs. I smiled, tracing my younger self, awkward school photos, birthday parties, muddy adventures by the creek. But then, a sharp, cold knot formed in my stomach. In nearly every picture, standing right beside me, was a child I didn't recognize. He was a boy, maybe 7 years old, with dark hair and a serious, unsmiling face. In one picture, taken at my 7th birthday, his small hand was touching the sleeve of my dress. In another, from a summer vacation when I was maybe 5, he was perched on the edge of the swing set watching me. I flipped through them faster, a frantic energy gripping me. I paused at a picture from my 10th birthday. I looked older, taller, but the boy next to me remained the same height, the same age, the same 7-year-old child. He hadn't aged a day across 5 years of my life. I spent the rest of the evening interrogating my phone. I texted my older brother. I called my distant cousin. Who is the boy in the photos, the one always next to me? No one knew him. They dismissed him as a neighborhood kid or a friend I'd forgotten. But how could a neighbor appear in pictures taken across 3 different states? And why did no one remember the serious little boy who was clearly present in every image? I tried to rationalize it, a glitch in my memory, an elaborate prank. But the chill in the air of the empty house deepened. I was falling asleep on the sofa that night, the house quiet except for the distant whir of the refrigerator, when the first thing happened. Tap, tap, tap. It was a soft, distinct knocking on the front door, just 3 taps, light and quick, the way a small child might knock. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs. It wasn't the sound of an adult fist. It was small. I crept to the door and peered through the peephole. The porch light illuminated only the empty, dew-damp porch. There was nothing. Just the dead silence of the Pennsylvania night. I backed away slowly, my eyes locked on the door. Then, my phone vibrated, jolting me. It was a text message from an unknown number. I swallowed hard and opened it. The text was simple, lacking punctuation, and the words seemed to freeze the air in the room. Do you remember me? I was always beside you. I dropped the phone on the wooden floor. I looked back at the attic box, at the frozen smile of my 7-year-old self, and at the unaging boy standing right there beside me. I was no longer dealing with a mystery. I was being contacted. And whatever it was, it had been waiting for me to come home. The text message wasn't a warning. It was a promise. I taped a blanket over the peephole and kept my phone face down, but there was no escaping him. Ethan. I had already started calling him Ethan in my head, the name from the newspaper clipping I'd found that morning. The boy who went missing from this very house 7 years old, 12 years before my family moved in. My life in the house became a series of frantic, isolated encounters. The haunting shifted from auditory to sensory. I'd be standing at the kitchen sink, and when I looked into the mirror above the vanity, I wouldn't see myself clearly. Instead, The edges of my reflection would blur, and for a fleeting, sickening moment, a small, dark shape would occupy the space behind my shoulder. It wasn't a grotesque phantom. It was just a kid, looking back at me with unblinking eyes, standing where no one was. Walking through the quiet streets of the town became unbearable. I'd be focused on the cracked pavement, and suddenly, the distinct sound of small footsteps, quick, light, like sneakers on concrete, would tap, tap, tap behind me. I would spin around, but the street was always empty, the sound swallowed by the oppressive silence. The messages continued, always from a different, untraceable number. Do you remember where we hid the key? Or, I'm bored. Let's play hide and seek. They were too specific, too personal to be random. They were the language of a child, and I had been the only one who had ever spoken it with him. My mind was reeling, trying to fit the pieces together. The unaging boy in the photos, the missing child named Ethan. Then it clicked with a terrifying clarity that felt like a bolt of lightning splitting my skull. Ethan wasn't just a ghost. He was my imaginary friend. Every memory I'd had of that period, my mother telling me to stop talking to the empty air, the games I insisted on playing alone, the secret spots I knew only we shared, they weren't the products of a lonely childhood. They were all real. I hadn't made him up. I had been interacting with a soul trapped in a loop, a spirit desperately clinging to the only living person who acknowledged him. This realization made the terror uniquely intimate. The haunting was tied to me, not the house. And now he wasn't content to just whisper and appear in mirrors. His presence turned physical. I found my car keys placed neatly inside my shoe. My favorite mug, the one I had just used, was found upside down on the top shelf of the pantry. It was the petty, misplaced mischief of a child trying to get attention. I could feel him, a chilling draft that followed me from room to room. One evening, I was examining an old cracked photo of us by the abandoned pond. I walked outside, drawn by a perverse curiosity. I stood at the muddy bank and looked down at the stagnant water. For a moment, my own reflection was clear. Then, just as in the mirror, it wavered. Not only did Ethan appear beside my watery image, but his reflection was moving. His shadow danced, skipping rocks across the surface, all while the air around the pond remained perfectly still. The movement was precisely that of a 7-year-old child at play. I stumbled back, tears finally blurring my vision. As I turned to run, a cold, unmistakable sensation brushed against my arm, like a tiny frozen hand quickly stroking my skin. I screamed. The final message arrived as I scrambled back inside, locking the door and pressing my back against it. It was no longer a question or a plea for play. It was a demand. You were the only one who stayed for me. Now you have to stay here forever. I knew then that my life was in danger, and the key to stopping him wasn't finding out how he died. It was destroying the last remnants of our connection. The photographs. I had to burn them all. The final desperate plan was simple. Destroy the anchor. If Ethan was bound to me by the memory trapped in those pictures, then burning them was the only way to sever the connection. I ripped the entire box from the attic, my hands trembling. I carried the stack of photographs outside to the cracked, overgrown driveway. The sun had set, and the Pennsylvania night was cold and deep. I gathered dry kindling and gasoline from the shed, acting purely on instinct. As I crouched over the growing pile, I could feel the atmosphere around me growing heavy and frigid, a cold that didn't belong to the night air. He was watching. He was resisting. I poured the gasoline and struck the match. The flames erupted with a hungry roar. I began throwing the photos onto the pyre. Each one curled and blackened instantly, the innocent images of my childhood, and Ethan's unchanging face beside me, turning to ash. The moment the first picture caught, a fierce, unnatural wind whipped around the yard, though the branches on the trees remained still. The fire crackled and spat, almost screaming. I heard it then. A faint, high-pitched wail carried on the wind, the sound of a child's tantrum and utter despair, muffled by the hungry flames. I didn't stop. I fed the fire every last image, watching until nothing was left but glowing embers. It was a terrifying, purifying act. When the last ember died down, the unnaturally cold air lifted. The silence returned, but this time, it felt empty, not heavy. He was gone. I didn't stay to question it. I finalized the sale of the house the next morning in a haze, signed the papers, and drove straight back to New York City. My apartment in Manhattan was my fortress, a space too loud, too high up, and too modern for the static of the past to cling to. For 3 days I breathed. I went back to work. I saw friends. The memories of the knocking, the shadows, and the messages began to fade, settling into the recesses of my mind like a horrible, unbelievable dream. I was free. I had survived. Then, late one evening, as I was scrolling mindlessly through news feeds, my phone vibrated with the familiar, sickening ping of a text message from an unknown number. My hand shook so badly I almost dropped the phone. I knew, before I even unlocked the screen, that the terror had followed me across state lines. The message had no context, no greeting, just a single, devastating sentence. The pictures burned, but I'm still here. The sheer, impossible knowledge that he had found me, that the bond was psychological, not physical, sucked the air from my lungs. I backed away from the device as if it were a venomous snake. He was no longer a ghost attached to a house. He was a permanent shadow on my soul. I stumbled back to the large modern window of my apartment, overlooking the glittering, indifferent skyline of the city. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass, trying to regain control. And there it was. Faintly etched into the corner of the glass, high above the relentless traffic, was a single tiny smudge, the outline of a small, childlike handprint. It was barely visible, yet absolutely undeniable. I stayed frozen there, breathing the recycled air of my safe high-rise apartment. I had escaped the house, but I hadn't escaped the friend. Ethan was still here, always beside me. I was alive, but the horror hadn't ended. It had merely been redefined. The small neighborhood felt shrink-wrapped in time. I was back home from college just for the semester break, but walking these sidewalks made me feel 11 again. The difference was, at 20, I was walking alone. The quiet here was different from the frantic noise of campus. It was heavy, weighted down by memory. The heaviest memory of all was Danny. He was the reason I was always half running from this town. My best friend, gone one afternoon without a trace. Just a missing person poster that eventually faded and was taken down. I'd finished my childhood without him, but that final, abrupt ending was the invisible fence I could never quite cross. Naturally, my feet led me straight to the playground. It was exactly the same. The chipped, primary-colored paint on the merry-go-round, the worn tire swing, the sprawling, ancient oak tree at the edge of the dirt field. It was too perfect. Nothing here had aged or changed. I sat on a rusty bench trying to feel the old comfort, but a knot of tension was tightening in my chest. The first sign of strangeness was subtle. I watched a red rubber ball resting near the sandpit. As I watched, the ball gave a single distinct bounce, landing a foot away from its original spot. There was no wind, no slope in the ground. It was like a child had just dribbled it, once, and let it go. I stood up, telling myself it was a fluke, a trick of the setting sun. Then I noticed the swing set. The tire swing, the one Danny and I used to compete to swing highest on, was rotating slowly, listing back and forth. It wasn't spinning wildly. It was moving in the gentle arc of someone recently climbing off. I scanned the entire park. Empty. Absolutely, definitively empty. This wasn't normal wear and tear. This was play. I started walking toward the center of the field, toward the spot where Danny and I had spent thousands of hours. That's when I heard it. It was faint, but unmistakable. The sound of small running feet hitting the dirt, circling the perimeter of the field. Thud, 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 thud. It was the quick, uneven rhythm of an 11-year-old in sneakers. The sound was coming from the far shaded end of the playground near the woods. I walked faster, my heart pounding a panicked drumbeat in my ears. I reached the edge of the field and strained my eyes into the shadows. Nothing. Not a squirrel, not a bird, and certainly not a child. The only sounds were my own ragged breathing and the far-off hum of traffic. I stood there for a full 5 minutes, trembling, trying to convince myself the sound was an echo of a car or a trick of the strange acoustics. Then, the running started again, right behind the rusty slide, closer this time. Thud, 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 thud. It stopped right at the base of the metal slide. A child was there. A child had to be there. "Hello?" I called out, the sound of my voice swallowed instantly by the dead air. "Is someone there?" The running didn't resume. Instead, a light, thin sound reached me, a sound that brought the icy terror right out of my memories. A soft, high-pitched giggle. It was a laugh I hadn't heard in years, a laugh that only belonged to one boy. Danny wasn't missing. He hadn't just left. He was still here, trapped in the only place he ever knew, and he was trying to start the game again. And I was the only one who could hear the whistle blow. The laughter was the catalyst. Once I admitted to myself that the phenomenon was supernatural and intrinsically linked to Danny, the playground became a stage for my terror. I stopped trying to rationalize the bouncing balls and the swinging tire. Instead, I tried to stay away, but the town felt smaller, and every street seemed to funnel me back to that field. The haunting intensified the moment I started actively avoiding it. Now, it wasn't just sounds. I'd catch flickers of movement in my peripheral vision, a flash of a blue t-shirt or the quick slide of a shadow on the edge of the houses as I drove past. He wasn't content to be trapped in the playground anymore. He was pursuing me. My isolation deepened. How do you tell someone that your dead childhood friend is trying to play dodgeball with your sanity? I began spending entire nights staring at the old amateur drawing I'd done years ago, taped to my bedroom wall. A frantic, childish depiction of the playground, the oak tree, and the two of us. It was a stupid focal point, but I couldn't tear it down. The breaking point came when I forced myself to go back to the field. I couldn't run anymore. I needed proof, or I needed to break. I walked straight to the base of the old oak tree, the place where Danny and I had sworn blood oaths and planned our escape from school. I stood there, daring the stillness to break. The air around me immediately dropped to an unbearable cold. It wasn't the temperature of the night. It was the chilling, absolute cold of a forgotten freezer. I felt a palpable pressure, as if a heavy, invisible weight had settled on my shoulders. Then my foot kicked something soft under the dirt. I knelt, scraping away the dry earth, and my fingers wrapped around a splintered wooden handle. I pulled it out, Danny's old, battered toy box. It was a cheap thing, painted with chipped decals of fighter jets, a box we'd searched for weeks after he disappeared. As my adult hands touched the familiar wood, a noise ripped through the silence. A long, agonizing groan like old wood protesting against a sudden, massive change in pressure. I snapped the flimsy metal clasp open. The box was empty, but the act of opening it felt like tearing a hole in the air. I looked up. In the twilight, standing about 20 feet away near the swing set, was a shadow. It was the definite shape of an 11-year-old boy. It wasn't transparent. It was a solid, churning black mass of pure darkness. I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. My gaze was locked on the figure. Then the shadow began to coalesce, the darkness focusing, and I saw a face emerge from the pitch black. It was 11 years old with the dark hair and slight build of my friend. But the features that solidified were not Danny's. They were mine. My own face, smooth and childish, was looking back at me from the black void. It was my eyes, mine and Danny's shared childish grin, frozen in a terrifying, possessive stare. The horrifying truth slammed into me. Danny wasn't just a ghost wanting to play. He was a powerful, elemental spirit attached to our friendship, seeking to bind me. He wanted to trap me in this place, but his ultimate goal wasn't just companionship. It was usurpation. He wanted to merge our identities, to drag me back to his age and continue his existence through my being. I stumbled backward, dropping the toy box. I ran home, slamming the door and locking it. I stood panting, staring at the old drawing on my wall, the one of the playground. As I watched, the tiny pencil-drawn figure of Danny in the corner, holding a stick figure ball, began to subtly darken. The pencil lines thickened, deepening into a realistic shadow that grew more three-dimensional by the second. He wasn't waiting at the playground anymore. The playground was now coming to me. The face on the wall, my own face, childish and shadowy looking back from the pencil-drawn playground, was the final breaking point. Danny wasn't just haunting the house. He was invading my being. He was trying to erase the years and force me back into the endless loop of his lost childhood. I didn't try to reason or fight the shadow. I knew that the real battle was internal, about refusing the illusion of our bond. My adult self had to sever the connection that my 11-year-old self had left vulnerable. I grabbed the toy box I'd brought back from the field. It felt lighter now, cold and frail. I took it outside to the backyard and used a hammer to smash it into kindling. I set the pieces ablaze in a metal trash can. As the cheap wood and faded jet decals caught fire, the air around the small flames didn't just grow cold, it became a vacuum. A high, desperate 11-year-old scream, a sound of pure, agonizing loss, ripped through the stillness of the neighborhood. It was the sound of Danny being torn from his final anchor. I didn't wait for the flames to die. I didn't wait for the sun to rise. I packed only the essentials, threw away the clothes I'd worn at the playground, and was on the highway before dawn. I abandoned college for the time being, driving nonstop until I reached the chaotic sensory overload of a large, distant city, a place so far removed from the quiet dirt of that small town that it felt like a different world. For weeks, I lived on adrenaline and the certainty that I was finally free. The sounds were gone. The shadows had vanished. The relentless noise of the city had successfully drowned out the whispers of the past. I was back to being just Jack, an anxious young man starting over. Then, one Tuesday, I was sitting alone in a small coffee shop, finally feeling relaxed enough to focus on a book. My phone sitting on the table beside my latte gave a short, untraceable ping. My hand froze. I knew that sound. I knew that specific cold pit in my stomach. I slowly picked up the phone. It was a text message from a blocked, unknown number. There was no greeting, no question mark, just the casual, familiar language of a childhood routine. "You're taking too long. Are you coming to play again?" I dropped my book. My entire body went rigid. Danny hadn't been defeated. He hadn't even been contained. He was no longer tied to the playground, or the toy box, or even the town. He was tied to me, to the memory of our friendship, and he had simply followed. I deleted the message. I got a new number, but it didn't matter. Days later, I was walking along a brick-lined path near my new apartment. I consciously kept my eyes focused straight ahead, breathing deep, trying to assert my adult reality. But as I passed a small, rusted sign advertising a distant, forgotten town fair, I heard it. Faint, soft, and just one single instance. The quick, light thud of a small sneaker on the pavement, right behind my heel. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I am alive. I am free from the physical prison of that town. But the fear remains, a permanent, cold passenger. Every unfamiliar ping on my phone, every unexpected swing of a distant pendulum, every childish sound carried on the wind. It reminds me, Danny isn't lost. He's simply waiting, always on the edge of my perception, eternally 11 and eternally ready for me to come back and play.